Chapter 8, Section 3, The Harlem Renaissance. Building background. During the Great Migration, New York City was a prime destination for many black migrants to the north. There, thousands of African Americans hoped to build better lives for themselves. In one New York neighborhood, black artists and intellectuals would begin a vibrant artistic and literary movement that would shape American culture. Roots of the Harlem Renaissance. During the Great Migration, thousands of African Americans flocked to New York City. Many migrants to New York settled in the neighborhood known as Harlem. Located in the northern portion of Manhattan Island, Harlem had first become a popular neighborhood for African Americans at the end of the 1800s. After World War I, Harlem became a center of black social and cultural life and activism. Many of the African Americans living in Harlem felt a strong sense of racial pride and identity. This spirit attracted a great many talented African American artists, writers, thinkers, and musicians who shared their experiences and encouraged one another to greater creative heights. A common theme was resistance to white prejudice and a pride in African American culture and heritage. For example, Harlem was home to the first branch of the NAACP, which opened in 1910. Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association was also headquartered in Harlem. A number of African Americans played an important role in encouraging and promoting the growth of black culture in Harlem. For example, W.E.B. Du Bois served as the editor of the NAACP's magazine, The Crisis. Published in Harlem, the magazine addressed issues of importance to African Americans across the nation. It also featured African American writing and poetry and helped promote racial pride and identity. The National Urban League also helped promote racial pride. Like the NAACP, the Urban League published a magazine, Opportunity, that highlighted black culture. Another notable figure in the development of African American culture in the early 1900s was Alain Locke. A philosophy professor at Howard University, Locke encouraged black artists to connect to their African heritage. He also pushed black authors to write about African American life. By 1917, emphasis on black culture had led to the artistic and literary movement known as the Harlem Renaissance. Black writers and poets. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the Harlem Renaissance dominated African American cultural life. During this period, artists expressed new ideas about black culture and black life in the United States. Among the most vocal artists of the new cultural movement were writers and poets. A burst of creativity. The emphasis on African American life and culture was initiated by white writers who focused on the black experience in the United States. Their work served to inspire African American writers and poets who burst onto the U.S. cultural scene during the Harlem Renaissance. Leading African American magazines such as The Crisis and Opportunity promoted the works of talented black writers. The National Urban League also encouraged African American writers by hosting an annual literary contest. The contest helped propel black writers into the mainstream of American literature. Some common themes among these writers were racial prejudice and racial pride and resistance to prejudice. Langston Hughes. One of the best-known writers of the Harlem Renaissance was poet, essayist, and playwright Langston Hughes. Hughes first drew national attention in 1921 at the age of 19 when his poem The Negro Speaks of Rivers appeared in The Crisis. In 1925, he won a poetry prize from Opportunity magazine, and he soon became one of the leading figures of the Harlem Renaissance. Hughes produced poems, plays, and novels that focused on black life and culture in the United States. He believed that black writers should express their individual dark-skinned selves without fear or shame. Many of his works used African American slang and musical rhythms and expressed the joy, suffering, and pride of being a black American. Hughes, who continued writing until his death in 1967, is still celebrated as one of the leading writers in American literature. Other writers and poets. In addition to Langston Hughes, dozens of other gifted writers took part in the cultural explosion in Harlem. Among them was James Weldon Johnson. In 1900, he co-wrote the song Lift Every Voice and Sing, which later became the official anthem of the NAACP. A political activist, Johnson helped organize anti-lynching activities for the NAACP and pushed for the passage of the Dyer Bill. As a writer, Johnson is perhaps best known for his 1927 book of poetry, God's Trombones, a collection of African American sermons written in verse. Some consider the collection to be among the finest works produced during the Harlem Renaissance. Another writer of the period was Claude McKay. McKay was considered the spokesperson for the more militant group of young black writers. One of his most famous poems, If We Must Die, deals with the violence of the Red Summer of 1919. McKay was one of the first writers of the Harlem Renaissance to gain widespread success. His 1928 best-selling novel, Home to Harlem, was the most successful novel by an African-American writer up to that time. Zora Neale Hurston was also a major contributor to the new literary movement in Harlem. Hurston's writing was deeply influenced by folklore, or traditional stories, sayings, and other art forms. Her interest in folklore led to the publication in 1935 of Mules and Men, a collection of African-American oral folk tales gathered during a study in Florida. Hurston also wrote plays, novels, and short stories. Her most famous novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, explores the world of a young black woman in the early 1900s, still feeling the legacy of slavery and discrimination. Hurston was not the only female writer to emerge during the Harlem Renaissance. As a literary editor for The Crisis, Jessie Redmond Fawcett not only helped promote the careers of writers such as Hughes and McKay, who was also a successful novelist herself. Nella Larson was another celebrated Harlem writer. Like Hurston and Fawcett, Larson often focused on the lives of African-American women. The popularity of the writers of the Harlem Renaissance soon led to the spread of their literary movement beyond New York. Black writers across the nation were inspired to publish their own works. From Washington, D.C. to Nashville to Los Angeles, writers emerged to contribute to the revitalization of black culture that was taking place. As writers like Claude McKay and Langston Hughes traveled the world, they influenced writers outside the United States as well. Musicians, artists, and performers. Literature was not the only focus of the Harlem Renaissance. African-American musicians, artists, and performers also took center stage in Harlem in the early 1900s. The Jazz Age. By the late 1920s, Harlem was the hotspot of a new form of music called jazz. The birth of jazz can be traced back to turn-of-the-century New Orleans, where African-American musicians blended several musical styles, including spirituals, blues, ragtime, marching band music, hillbilly music, and various European traditions. The result was a wholly original American form of music that was new, different, and very exciting. As African Americans moved to northern cities like Chicago and New York, jazz traveled with them. Part of what made jazz so exciting was that while a jazz song might start with a known melody or theme, much of the music was improvised or composed on the spot. Jazz could be fast or slow, and it was easy to dance to. In short, jazz was not defined by a clear set of rules, but rather by its spirit and creativity. Man, if you had to ask what it is, a legendary jazz musician Louis Armstrong once stated, you'll never know. Louis Armstrong was the leading performer on the Harlem jazz scene, which was centered at clubs such as the Savoy Ballroom and the Cotton Club. Fans flocked to Harlem to hear Armstrong and other leading performers of the day, including Cab Calloway and composers Duke Ellington and Fats Waller. Clubgoers also came to Harlem ready to dance. Jazz fans invented new dance steps as the music inspired them, including the jitterbug and the Lindy Hop, named after Charles Lindbergh. Jazz fans also came to Harlem to see Bessie Smith, the Empress of the Blues. Smith began her career as a teenager, singing her own down-home version of the blues in small cafes throughout the South. By 1923, she had moved to New York City and signed with Columbia Records. Smith's first release, Downhearted Blues, sold over 2 million copies. Over the next few years, Smith would record with all of the top jazz musicians and earn an incredible $2,000 a week for her performances. Together with Louis Armstrong, she is credited with developing the tradition of jazz singing. Black artists. Alongside writers such as Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, black painters, sculptors, photographers, and filmmakers contributed to the creative energy in Harlem during the 1920s and 1930s. These artists were united by a desire to create art that expressed the history and experiences of African Americans. Painter Aaron Douglas was among the leading artists of the Harlem Renaissance. Often called the father of African American art, Douglas was the first black artist to experiment with modernism and to use symbols from African art in his paintings, murals, and illustrations. By contrast, sculptor and art educator Augusta Savage created stunningly realistic symbols of black pride and aspirations, including sculptures of W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. Together with other Harlem Renaissance artists, Louise Mailloux Jones, James Van Der Zee, and William H. Johnson, to name a few, they captured the black experience in clay, on canvas, and on film. Black performers. Before the Harlem Renaissance, African Americans had few opportunities in the theater world. At the turn of the century, most theatrical productions were the creation of white playwrights and performers. Black actors were generally limited to minor roles that encouraged racial stereotypes. Over time, however, African American performers began taking part in theatrical productions in Harlem. In 1917, an all-black group of actors gained praise for their performances in a series of one-act plays performed at the Garden Theater in New York's Madison Square Garden. African American performers scored another success with the 1921 production of Shuffle Along. A musical written, performed, and produced by blacks, the show brought African American theater to popularity. Many talented African American performers got their start in New York theater during this period. Some starred in vaudeville, a sort of early variety show that combined acting, music, and comedy, such as Bill Bojangles Robinson, whose tap performances amazed audiences in New York and around the world. He went on to become one of the first black American stars on Broadway and in Hollywood. Actor Paul Robeson also drew critical acclaim for his dramatic performances. The Harlem Renaissance draws to a close. The Harlem Renaissance, a time of great cultural achievement, was not confined only to New York. Black writers, musicians, and artists had great appeal around the nation and the world. Jazz styles gained popularity in Chicago, Paris, and other cities. Writers and poets across the nation imitated the styles of Harlem writers. Black and white Americans alike were captivated by the new styles that originated in Harlem. In later years, historians noted the spread of the ideas of the Harlem Renaissance to other parts of the United States. Gradually, the scope of the Harlem Renaissance came to be the whole of the United States. African Americans everywhere became more articulate. There were poetry circles in Houston and Detroit, little theaters in Chicago and Los Angeles, and interested students of painting in Cleveland and Nashville. Long before the beginning of the Depression, the groups in Harlem could claim no monopoly, but they could claim some credit for the widespread interest in the new efforts at self-expression in various parts of the country. John Hope Franklin and Alfred A. Moss, Jr., From Slavery to Freedom, 1998. The Harlem Renaissance had roared through the 1920s. By the 1930s, however, the period was drawing to a close. As several leaders of the movement, such as W.E.B. Du Bois and James Weldon Johnson, moved away from Harlem, the movement lost some of its steam. Another key factor in the decline of the Harlem Renaissance was the economic depression that struck the United States in 1929. As Americans struggled to find work and earn a living, the artistic movement that had flourished in the 1920s slowly declined. While the movement eventually came to a close, its influence did not. Writers such as Langston Hughes and artists such as Aaron Douglas continued their popularity through the 1930s and beyond. In fact, many participants from Harlem still influence the arts today. The Harlem Renaissance had created a unique cultural movement of which all Americans could be proud.